Okay, welcome to our unit 1945 to 1989, where we're focusing on two main global events or developments. One would be the Cold War, and one would be decolonization. So, our topic 8.2 focuses on what caused the Cold War. So, what you're going to learn from watching this video, first of all, you should be able to, at the end of this, explain the causes of the Cold War. And you're going to show your understanding through doing the assignment that I attached, writing sourcing statements. So, how this is going to work is, first of all, we're going to review what was the Cold War. Then I'm going to introduce my argument about the two causes. And then finally, you're going to work on sourcing and review practice using updated CHAPI. So let's talk about the context. In topic 8.1, we focused on the context. So when we kind of build the context for this unit, we ask ourselves, what was the world like in 1900? So we have to establish that it was European dominated, that we have many areas that are under imperial control, and that there's a great deal of nationalism, militarism, alliances, and a lot of competition over land. So this leads us to the outgrowth of global conflicts. Now, throughout World War I and World War II, we have two really important changes. One, we have the strengthening and the starting of the decolonization movement because two times at the beginning of World War I and at the beginning of World War II, the Western nations that were in power promised to discuss self-determination, but both times they failed. Secondly, Britain and France, along with Germany, all decline as world powers. They declined because they're heavily in debt. They're declined because they've lost a great deal of their population. In their place, in 1945, rises the United States and the Soviet Union. And the reason why they became powerful is because, on one hand, they had two of the world's best militaries. And secondly, they were the only ones that really economically came out of it on the positive side. So this is the context that we're working with. So it's this context that we're talking about when it leads to the Cold War. So what was the Cold War? Well, the Cold War is a state of diplomatic hostility, meaning that the troops of the Soviet Union and the troops of the United States never got into it on the battlefield. Rather, they were two superpowers that used their military powers and their money to help nations becoming independent. And they competed through establishing hegemony, which is influence, but also to spread their ideology. Now, the Cold War begins in 1945 because of some things that went on in World War II, and it's going to end in 1989 when the Soviet Union fell. Now, this is going to be a total war because it's going to take place all across the world, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. So when we talk about the causes, we're going to build this like an argument. So this would be my thesis. The Cold War was caused by tension between the United States and the USSR at the end of the Second World War over the role of self-determination in the post-war world. Due to their different ideologies, both states became world powers because of their military and economic power and sought to gain allies for political and economic nationalism. So looking at this thesis, my main two causes will be disagreements at the end of the Second World War over the role of self-determination, and the fact that they're ideologically different and sought to spread this ideology for both political and economic nationalism. So let me go a little bit more in detail. So when we talk about the tension that arose because of the end of World War II and allowing people to choose their own form of government, this is really a result of disagreements over the post-war world. Let me explain. It begins with the Atlantic Charter. And the Atlantic Charter was a secret agreement between the United States and Great Britain that outlined the goals of the war for the Allies. Now, this took place long before Pearl Harbor. Now, goal number one was the destruction of the Nazis and later the Japanese. But the second goal is going to be the one that they're going to disagree on. They're going to support the right of all people in the world to choose the form of government under which they live in. And that's what self-determination is. They're going to create a permanent system of general security to kind of enforce this. So in 1941, we're already seeing that the United States and Great Britain, they're beginning to plan the post-war world. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to remove those causes of the First World War and the Second World War. Most importantly, the competition over land. So on December 7th, 1941, the United States is bombed at Pearl Harbor, and the United States enters the war. And they formally create an alliance called the Allies. This is between not only the United States, but also Great Britain and about some other nations, but they're not important right now. So with the formation of the Allies, they agreed on 4 policies that kept them together, meaning that all allies had to agree with this. First, they're going to defeat Germany first, then Japan. They're going to focus on a military solution first and leave the political questions of the freed areas until after the war. They're only going to accept the unconditional surrender from the Axis powers, and all members had to accept the terms of the Atlantic Charter. In 1942, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union joined the Allies and agreed to these terms, meaning that the Soviet Union agreed to allow areas that they liberated their own self-determination. Now, as the war progressed through 1943, 1944, and 1945, we have 3 people planning the end of the war, but also constructing the post-war world. We have Winston Churchill from Great Britain, Franklin Roosevelt from the United States, and Joseph Stalin from the Soviet Union. Now, these 3 people were allies out of necessity. And make no bones about it, they didn't get along. Churchill and Stalin did not like each other, and that's why Roosevelt sat in the middle. But the problem was this: the United States and Great Britain had to remain friendly with the Soviet Union to keep them involved in the war. At their first meeting at Yalta, we begin to see some disagreement. Basically, what they decided to do as the war came to an end in 1945 is to divide Germany into 4 equal zones of occupation, and essentially to make Germany pay some money to the Soviet Union for fighting them. Now, in return, the Soviet Union agreed to declare war on Japan. Now, this is where they began to really disagree. The Soviet Union was freeing Eastern Europe on its way toward Germany, and the United States and Great Britain were freeing Western Europe on its way to Germany as well. Here, Stalin began to balk at the idea of self-determination, stating that he really didn't feel like he should allow the people in Eastern Europe their own self-determination, that he was going to make Eastern Europe communist. But Roosevelt and Churchill knew that they needed the Soviet Union in the war, so this issue wasn't settled. The next conference was Potsdam. And notice that, first of all, this is after the war in Europe is done. Secondly, by this picture, you also notice we've had some changes. On the left, we have Clement Attlee, who replaced Winston Churchill as Prime Minister of Great Britain. And we have Harry S. Truman in the middle, who replaced Franklin Roosevelt after he passed away. Now, the reason why Truman is smiling so much is not because he smiles for pictures. It's because he's just been informed that the bomb works. So he's in a very strong kind of bargaining position. But then again, so is Joseph Stalin. At Potsdam, Joseph Stalin outwardly refuses to give Eastern Europe its self-determination, making it communist to create a protective barrier. As he argued, in the last 110 years, the Soviet Union, or Russia, has been invaded from Western Europe 3 times, causing destruction. So on the surface, it sounds like he's trying to protect the Soviet Union. What he's actually trying to do is spread communism. So when we look at the big picture, how did World War II cause the Cold War? It's essentially disagreements about the post-war world. As a member of the Allies, all 62 nations, including the Soviet Union, promised to allow people to accept their own government. But when push comes to shove and the end of the war occurs, well, Stalin reneges on that promise and focuses on spreading communism in Eastern Europe. The second cause is an ideological struggle, meaning that different ideas. So when we look at them, we have the Soviet side, also known as the Eastern Bloc. Or you might have heard this, behind the Iron Curtain. First of all, economically, they're communist, focusing on publicly owned factories and the means of production to make things fair, especially for the worker. Now, because Lenin kind of was a little bit different from Karl Marx, he believed that the transition to true communism required very strong and very strict leadership. So the Soviet Union is very authoritarian. As your book described, almost totalitarian, one-party rule, control of everything. Now, their goal is to spread communism worldwide. The United States side, on the other hand, well, they're democratic and they're capitalist. Their democracy focused on protecting people's rights, giving the individual the certain freedoms that were guaranteed by the Enlightenment, and an economy that promotes free trade and promotes the entrepreneur. Now, their goal was not to abolish communism, but to contain communism where it was. This is an idea by a gentleman by the name of George Kennan, who stated that communism was like water and needed to be contained where it was, hoping that the communist nations would eventually collapse. So what you have here is you've got 2 directly opposite political and economic systems. Now, where this becomes a struggle is the 2 sides are competing to spread that ideology for political nationalism, meaning that these states wanted a number of people that agreed with their ideology, and that number determined their power. But also economic nationalism, because at the end of World War II, we have the natural recession that could develop into a depression. Capitalist countries want free trade across the borders, and the communist countries basically want a group of nations to trade for themselves. So literally what they're doing is they're competing for the decolonized world. So overall, when we talk about the different ideologies, the US wants to respect the right of those to choose the government and wants economic freedoms. The USSR wants to spread communism and wants a communist economic system. So what caused the Cold War? Well, when we review, essentially what we have is we've got different points of view on the conquered land. and different points of view about self-determination. On one hand, when the land is liberated, it should be allowed after the war to determine its own government. But on the Soviet side, once they're freed, they should be allowed to spread communism. And then we have different ideologies that are competing for the third world. Essentially, as nations become decolonized, they get recruited by the communist side or the capitalist side. And that determines, first of all, political nationalism, but also gives them an avenue of economic outlet. Okay, so your assignment is to read through the causes of the Cold War DBQ. I need you to look at the See Happy sentence stems for sourcing assignment. And what I need you to do is two things. One, I need you to determine, first of all, what the document would be used for. Would it be used as evidence to support the idea of post-war disagreements about self-determination? Or would it be used to show different ideologies and their competition? Secondly, I need you to choose 4 documents, and you're going to write a sourcing statement. Look at the stems that I've provided. Now, you're going to need to do 1 for historical situation, 1 for intended audience, 1 for purpose, and 1 for authorial point of view. This will be taken up when you come to class Tuesday or Wednesday. Thanks.